Christ is risen. Good evening. A warm welcome to everyone on this call participating from different parts of the world. My name is Katerina Pekridou, and I serve the Conference of European Churches as Executive Secretary for Theological Dialogue. For several years, I have been a member of the Volos Academy for Theological Studies, and I have the pleasure of moderating today's discussion. I would like to start with some practical information on the virtual meeting. So first of all, there is simultaneous translation into Greek, and I am going to explain in Greek how participants can choose the channel that allows them to follow the Greek translation. Για όσους λοιπόν επιθυμούν να παρακολουθήσουν την μετάφραση του σεμιναρίου στα ελληνικά, στο κάτω μέρος της οθόνης σας στα δεξιά, μπορείτε να κάνετε κλικ πάνω στο εικονίδιο με τις δύο γλώσσες και να επιλέξετε την ελληνική γλώσσα. Continuing now with the second point of information, as usual, the lecture is being recorded and it will be made available on the YouTube channel of Volos Academy soon after the meeting. Third, all microphones and cameras are muted. If participants wish to raise a question, please raise your virtual hands or type your question or comment in the chat box or the Q&A section at the bottom of your screen. I will be monitoring the screen, the chats, and the Q&A sections, and I will give you the floor with the help of our technical assistant, who will provide access to your microphone and camera. If you are making an intervention, I kindly ask you to keep your questions and your comments really short. Because of the simultaneous translation, I would like to ask all of us to speak clearly and slowly so that we can facilitate the translation process. At this moment, I would like to invite the director of Volos Academy for Theological Studies, Dr. Pantelis Kalaitsidis, to extend a greeting to the seminar. Panteli, I hand over to you. Panteli, can you hear us? I think there is a problem with the microphone, maybe, and your camera. Ah, here you are. Unmute, please.
Sorry. Θα μιλήσω ελληνικά. Σεβασμιότατε, σεβαστοί πατέρες, φίλες και φίλοι της Ακαδημίας Θεολογικών Σπουδών, Χριστός Ανέστη για τελευταία μέρα. Έχουμε την ιδιαίτερη χαρά και τιμή να φιλοξενούμε απόψε στο διαδικτυακό, στο ηλεκτρονικό βήμα της Ακαδημίας Θεολογικών Σπουδών, τον σεβασμιότατο Αρχιεπίσκοπο πρώην Κανταουρίας Ροαν Γουίλιαμς, επιφανή θεολόγο, ομότιμο καθηγητή του Πανεπιστημίου του Κέιμπριτζ, ειδικό μελετητή της Ορθόδοξης Θεολογίας και Πνευματικότητας, ο οποίος θα μας μιλήσει με θέμα τι είναι η χριστιανική πολιτική, σκέψεις με αφορμή το έργο του πατρός Σέργιου Μπουλγκάκοφ. Όταν σχεδιάζαμε με τον συνάδελφο Νίκο Ασπρούλη, τον αναπληρωτή διευθυντή της Ακαδημίας Θεολογικών Σπουδών, τη σειρά αυτή των διαδικτυακών διαλέξεων, θεωρήσαμε και λόγω του ενδιαφερόντος που εδώ και χρόνια η Ακαδημία μας έχει και για τα θέματα της πολιτικής θεολογίας, αλλά και για τη ρωσική θεολογία και πνευματικότητα, για τη ρωσική θεολογία της διασποράς και για τη ρωσική θρησκευτική φιλοσοφία, θεωρήσαμε λοιπόν σκόπιμο να περιλάβουμε ένα θέμα για την πολιτική θεολογία του πατρός Σέργιου Μπουλγκάκοφ, πολλό μάλλον που την περσινή χρονιά, το 2021, είχαμε τα 150 χρόνια από τη γέννησή του και μάλιστα, όπως ίσως μερικοί θυμάστε, σε συνεργασία με το Κέντρο Ορθοδόξων Χριστιανικών Σπουδών του Πανεπιστημίου του Φόρνταμ και με το Ινστιτούτο Οικουμενικών Ερευνών και το Κέντρο Ερευνών για τον πατέρα Σέργιο Μπουλγκάκοφ του Πανεπιστημίου του Φριβούργου, διοργανώσαμε στα τέλη του Αυγούστου και στις αρχές Σεπτεμβρίου 2021 στο Φριβούργο μεγάλο διεθνές συνέδριο για τον πατέρα Σέργιο Μπουλγκάκοφ, το οποίο λάμπρινε με την παρουσία του ο σεβασμιότατος Αρχιεπίσκοπος Ροαν Γουίλιαμς, ο οποίος και έδωσε την κεντρική, την εισαγωγική διάλεξη ομιλία. Όταν λοιπόν σχεδιάζαμε αυτό το κύκλο ομιλιών, δεν θα μπορούσαμε να φανταστούμε την επικαιρότητα που θα είχε μια τέτοια συζήτηση, καθώς όπως όλοι γνωρίζουμε, οι πρόσφατες τραγικές εξελίξεις στην Ουκρανία με τη ρωσική εισβολή και με τον πόλεμο κάνουν όλη αυτή τη συζήτηση εξαιρετικά ενδιαφέρουσα. Δεν θέλω να κρατήσω το λόγο, ήθελα απλώς να χαιρετήσω, ήθελα να ευχαριστήσω τον Αρχιεπίσκοπο Ρόαν Williams για την αποδοχή της πρότασής μας και για την τιμή που μας κάνει να απευθύνει τη σημερινή ομιλία από το διαδικτυακό βήμα της Ακαδημίας, όπως επίσης και να ευχαριστήσω τη συνάδελφο Κατερίνα Πεκρίδου που δέχτηκε να συντονίσει την απόψινή εκδήλωση. Θα σταματήσω εδώ. Στο τέλος της εκδήλωσης θα πω ορισμένα λόγια έτσι για το κλείσιμο και θα παραδώσω αμέσως το λόγο στη συντονίστρια και στον υψηλό προσκεκλημένο. Να είστε καλά.
Thank you so much, Pantelis, for this wonderful introduction. It is really an honor and a unique privilege for the Academy and for me personally to have the Right Reverend Dr. Rowan Williams with us today. And I'm delighted to introduce this renowned public theologian, Bishop of the Anglican Church, and gifted poet as the speaker of this final seminar of the series Time for Action. Rowan Williams has recently retired as Master of the Magdalen College in Cambridge, and he taught theology in Oxford, Cambridge, Bristol, and Yale. Dr. Williams is a distinguished theologian widely known for his academic work, which is both profound and broad in scope. A scholar of the Church Fathers, Christian spirituality, and sources of the mystical tradition, with special attention to Teresa of Avila, John of the Cross, and Thomas Merton, Dr. Williams obtained his Doctor of Philosophy degree with a dissertation on the work of the 20th century Russian theologian Vladimir Lossky in 1975. He has been studying and publishing on contemporary theological themes and authors since 1983, and probably earlier than that. In doing so, he has been concerned with questions at the interface of religion, culture, and society. Dr. Williams speaks and writes about social vision, racism, violence, religious plurality, armament, and peace. He has published on significant modern theologians such as Barth, Runner, von Balthasar, as well as key theological themes such as the Trinity, Revelation, Tradition, Resurrection, Art, and Love. He is also known for his engagement in the discussion about the nature of postmodern theology, which examines how the Christian faith can adequately relate to contemporary European society. From 2002 to 2012, in his role as the Archbishop of Canterbury, Primate of the Church of England, and the symbolic head of the worldwide Anglican Communion, Dr. Williams argued for a community that can live with complexity and difference, and worked hard to keep all sides within the communion talking to one another while addressing disagreements over questions around female bishops and homosexuality. Further, he took the lead in conversations about the place of religion in current post-secular and post-Christian culture and society. He made efforts to strengthen ecumenical and Christian-Muslim relations and argued for the concrete integration of Muslims while warning against ideas of a clash of civilizations. Among other things, he responded to the attacks of 9/11, the war in Iraq, and the British participation in it. He reflected on the economic crisis and ecological problems, but also took a very nuanced and critical look at the neo-Darwinian new atheism. Meanwhile, Dr. Williams is also a husband, married to Hilary Jane Williams, who is also a writer and lecturer in theology, and he's a father to 2 children. He is a talented poet with collections published in 1994, 2001, and 2008, and a social justice and peace activist. The list of Dr. Williams's publications is really extensive, as it reflects his research interests and engagement with societal questions. I will refer to his most recent works that include Justice and Love, a philosophical dialogue, a book which is co-authored with Mary Zurnazi and was published in 2020. And also the most recent, Looking East in Winter, Contemporary Thought and the Eastern Christian Tradition, published in 2021, a volume which introduces the reader to aspects and personalities of our own Orthodox Christian world. This volume is currently being translated into Greek and will be published by Emplo Publications. For the Greek audience, please check our website and read the press release later after the seminar is over. There are also two other titles, two other books that have been translated for some time now into Greek, which you can find later. I would also like to draw your attention to the book published in 1999, Sergius Bulgakov, Towards the Russian Political Theology, texts edited and introduced by Rowan Williams, which was published by T&T Clark, and which offers a representative selection and engagement with books and essays of the author, of the formative years of the author. This evening, Dr. Williams will address the question, what is Christian politics? And he's going to discuss insights from the work of Sergius Bulgakov. His presentation will offer reflection and hopefully some guidance for us on how to approach contemporary questions of church and society, especially at the moment of serious crisis in Europe with the war that the director already referred to. Dr. Williams, a very warm welcome to you. We are really honored and delighted that you are here. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Katerina and Pandelis. Christos Anesti. It is a very great honor and a very great delight to be invited to share in the discussion of this seminar. I've decided to speak about Sergius Bulgakov's complex and developing attitude to socialism, a major aspect of his political thinking. His Christian socialist period was confined, strictly speaking, to his abortive involvement in national politics in the middle of the first decade of the 20th century in Russia. But he continued to be deeply engaged in the attempt both to understand socialism as a phenomenon that was more than just political, and also to articulate a theological foundation for some kind of Christian political witness. Throughout his life in exile, mostly in Paris, he maintained his criticisms of simple political reaction, his criticism of nostalgia for an autocratic patriarchy, his brief flirtation with a kind of mystical monarchism in the years of the First World War and the Revolutionary era does not leave much of a mark in his later writing. But it is clear that socialism, for him, had come to mean not so much a political program as an ideal type of human self-understanding, something always on the verge of becoming hostile to the church, to the degree that it refuses to ground itself in the reality of the church. And that is a point Bulgakov was already making in his Christian socialist days earlier on. You see that in some of the early essays collected in Dva Grada, Two Cities. So this lecture will look in detail at his most extended later discussion of socialism, his essay on the soul of socialism, which was published in two parts in the Russian émigré periodical Novy Grad in 1932 and 1933. And I'll attempt in discussing this to clarify how he sees the socialist consciousness relating to ecclesial reality. Bulgakov's theological thinking had already embraced the conviction that this ecclesial reality was above all something very much more than just a historical and human institution. This theme is highlighted in what can be considered his first real theological manifesto, the long work Svetny Večerny, The Unfading Light, in 1917. And it's stated with clarity in his writings in exile. The Church is both created and uncreated, he wrote in his Hail lecture of 1934 on social teaching in modern Russian Orthodox theology. Ultimately, the Church is no less than the entire creation restored to its essential nature as the self-revealing of God, creation unified in and transfigured by Sophia, the divine wisdom, which is, for Bulgakov, the inner form of the divine life that is shared by the divine persons, the object of the selfless self-love which the divine persons eternally share with one another. The Church is creation completely transparent to its creator, in all its relations and activities, human and non-human. The Church is the moral and spiritual shape, the form of all properly human agency. And truly human agency is whatever brings the world closer to its Sophianic identity, its identity in God's Sophia, God's wisdom. History, he writes, history is the self-definition and self-revelation of the human. That's from the essay on the Soul of Socialism. And this self-definition of the human is emphatically a historical task for Christians. It requires decision, intelligence, and energy, and not a retreat towards an imagined, idealized past. But it's different from a conviction of irreversible natural progress in history. The unfolding of history, says Bulgakov, brings us closer to the apocalypse, to the revealing of Antichrist as well as the coming again of Christ. So what develops in history is not the steady advance of a Christian control over circumstances, but a steady growth in discernment between good and evil. The trajectory, the movement of history, is not towards some guaranteed triumph for the kingdom of God, but towards a more and more intensified and purified prayer for the coming of Christ. That intensification and purification will not happen without our conscious commitment here and now to God's future, to the transparent and reconciled cosmos in which wisdom prevails. And this is, Bulgakov argues in the Hail lecture, this is the priority for the Church's approach to public and social matters. As long as history continues, the Church, he says, is growing and ripening in its discernment, and so growing in its openness to its own character as Sophianic. But this does not guarantee a unified and stable world, and part of Bulgakov's concern, as we shall see, is that the pressure to secure a unified, stable world is one of the risks that the socialist mindset invites, as he sees it. So let's return to the long essay of 1932-1933. Bulgakov begins by distinguishing between what he calls the socialism of public policy, that is the protection of the rights of labor, the public control of the unbridled freedom of capital, and on the other hand, socialism as a spiritual phenomenon. About the former, about policy, he's startlingly direct, almost casual. Of course, the Church must support such protections and restrictions. There is nothing new about this. But the new, distinctive and difficult problem, he says, is the latter, the challenge posed by socialism's soul rather than its body. The body being just the collection of legal policies needed to guarantee common prosperity and security in society. The problem is that socialism, as he sees it, has an anthropology, a doctrine of human nature, and this is shaped by what he calls sociologism and economism. He defines these in turn as a discourse that takes for granted the reality and even the priority of collective identities, ethnic identities, class-based identities, or whatever, and a discourse preoccupied with how humans interact with and manage their radical dependence on the natural world. Once again, he says, these are not in themselves hostile to Jewish Christian categories. The Bible itself regularly presents history in terms of personified collectives, and the vocation of human beings to make both sense and manageable resource out of the material world is built into the Christian view of the human role in creation. But the problem with what he calls economism is that in a fallen human environment, we lose sight of what the full sense is that has to be made of the world. By casting our economic life in the social Darwinist terms of a struggle for existence, we identify our transformative and creative labor simply with a battle against death. And so economic life becomes a slavery to death, because it pivots upon the central fear of losing our place within a cosmos that has become intrinsically dangerous to us as humans, rather than a cosmos whose Sophianic interdependence assures our life. So Bulgakov opposes Marx's narrative of a long prehistory that is about to come to an end in the timeless, rational justice of the post-revolutionary world, with the speculations of Nikolai Fyodorov, the very idiosyncratic 19th century Russian thinker, who argued that the common task of humanity was the resurrection of the dead, transforming the natural world in such a way that all the ancestors are returned to share life with us. Now, as Bulgakov indicates, we might take the details of Fyodorov's ideas with a pinch of salt, but he represents a powerful symbol of what Karl Marx denies and what Christianity affirms, which is that history has already begun, that all existing historical subjects, past and present, have worth and dignity, and that our labor in the world must be directed to the highest degree of hospitality towards this human community, extended in time as well as space. Bulgakov moves on in his essay to reflect on the ambivalence of the revolutionary psyche. On the one hand, the nihilism of revolutionary violence, the obsessive destruction of what has been inherited, including religious culture and institutions, is a sickness. But it is a sickness produced by passions and longings deeply ingrained in the human subject. The utopian strain in the human mind, which does indeed react to the historically given with a sentiment of global protest. The difficulty arises when this sentiment is fleshed out as the actual destruction of real persons for the sake of an imagined future. Bulgakov observes how in some sorts of Marxist language, the dream of a scientifically managed future becomes, ironically, yet another variety of spiritual utopianism, choosing the unreal over the real in the name of a materialist reductionism. It echoes a comment he's made a few pages earlier, where he notes that the Promethean scientism that tries to convert the entire material environment into a humanly controlled system actually reduces the scope of matter itself, shrinking the material world to the dimension simply of what can be successfully managed by human minds. In other words, there is a kind of materialism that effectively alienates us from matter, partly by alienating us from time and from narrative. And I think here of the recent monumental work of the British psychoanalyst and philosopher Ian McGilchrist, who has argued this at great length. But Bulgakov's point here is that utopianism, which has no content in terms of tasks to be completed, tasks that require the specific historical resources and the free decisions of actual personal agents in the present, such utopianism will always be a snare, a danger, so long as there is no awareness that we are always already involved in an exchange of energy and information through both historical and natural processes, an exchange whose direction is always towards the maximal harmony and transparency already mentioned, the Sophianic future. Secularism, or more accurately in Bulgakov's eyes, neo-paganism, is the Weltanschauung in which the goal of a totally managed environment, human and material, acts as an absolute formative force in present decision-making. The exhaustive rationalization of the physical world, the exhaustive account of human motivation and imagination in physicalist, materialist terms, the creation of a wholly predictable environment. All these become the encompassing constraints within which we plan and project the future. A future which is regarded both as the inevitable outcome of a mechanical temporal process and as the vision for whose realization we must struggle. A revolutionary paradox which Bulgakov had already discussed in much earlier work, like his famous essay in 1909 in the Symposium Viechi. And this is ultimately how Bulgakov sees the soul of socialism. And strikingly, he identifies the same thing in the logic of advanced capitalism as much as in the communist worldview. The aspiration to contain and control the material environment, the aspiration to chart and to police the exercise of human activity in terms of its performance of determined functions is common to both socialism and capitalism. Both lack a real vocabulary for the personal. Both regard actual physical reality as a potential enemy to be subdued and totally instrumentalized. And this is why Bulgakov's critique of socialism is not a defense either of market capitalism or of pre-modern social forms. Allegiance to tradition, he says, is not loyalty to immobility, but the plain exercise of human memory in its proper function of attending to the past and allowing to the past the dignity of making the present possible. Things do change. Social possibilities alter radically. And it is no part of the Christian task just to turn back the clock. Bulgakov distinguishes, in typically complex ways, between the idea of meaningful, intentional activity with cumulative effects and the idea of some end of history that could be attained by such activity. Theology allows us to make sense of and to pursue purposeful historical action while retaining a kind of skepticism about any notion of an ideally, finally settled future. Indeed, one way of reading Bulgakov's scheme is to see him as showing how theology refuses two opposite fantasies of immobility: the idealized past of the conservative and the unimprovable future of the utopian revolutionary. In contrast, we as Christians are necessarily involved in meaningful labor within history, learning how to discern what does and does not serve the Sophianic kingdom. And that includes the learning of how our previous understandings may have been faulty and how to serve at the same time the same unchanging direction of divine will in a different social climate. That social climate today is one of depersonalization, says Bulgakov, whether that comes from the right or the left. The apparently self-evident inherited understanding of social roles characteristic of pre-modern society has gone forever. And this means that aspects of the biblical ethic that depend on their working for the benign operation of a patriarchal system, masters being kind to slaves, for instance, cannot now be treated as definitive. This doesn't mean simply ignoring or condemning those inherited understandings. There's no point in castigating pre-modern discourse for being pre-modern, Bulgakov seems to imply. But the dissolution of older, organic social patterns, while it may have shattered some kinds of solidarity, has also made possible new perspectives on personal dignity or liberty, a new depth of understanding of what it is in humanity that resists the totalizing pressures of functionalism and rationalism. It's another historical paradox, in that the emergence of the modern self has brought both Promethean ambitions for human control over human destiny and an enhanced sense of the mysterious inwardness and inaccessibility of the human subject. And the challenge for the Church is to affirm the purposiveness and creativity of the modern self, but in so doing, also to orient that purposiveness towards the Sophianic goal of creation as a whole. In other words, the Church should not be wasting its energies resisting modernity as such. It must address the central deficit in modernity, the reductionist fantasies of control, and address them from within modernity. However, it is crucial in Bulgakov's understanding that the Church continues to see itself as more than a social agent among others, and that the Church refuses to be co-opted by any social or national polity as just a contributor to other and higher values, as he puts it. It's interesting to note that this is a position which has some significant features in common with a very different theologian, the German Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who insists in his Ethics that the Church should not seek to defend a position within a social territory or a state apparatus. The Church both signifies and embodies a defining network of relations with God, the world, and other subjects, in which the human person is maximally free for gift, for love, and mutuality. Its relation to the social enterprises and ideals that surround it in a modern pluralist world is, Bulgakov implies, one of discerning and evaluating how far this or that social project, this or that legal reform enables or disables human growth towards Sophianic maturity, and thus towards the eschatological communion which is sacramentally present in the Church's life. But in this interpretative and discerning role, the Church cannot look to be a coercive decision maker for society at large. It has to work at transforming motivation and vision. It has a creative role within any social order. Mere ascetical withdrawal into uncompromised purity is not a Sophianic option. The Church has a creative role in that it seeks to set out a vision for the human that will steadily press towards structural changes. So St. Paul's injunctions to slave owners about how they are to view their slaves will gradually dissolve the structure of slavery itself. And to take the modern example discussed by Bulgakov, an insistence on the mutual dependence and duties of different social classes is where we must begin in changing the class-based structure of contemporary societies. Once again, it's a theme that Bulgakov was discussing even before the First World War. Now, Bulgakov does not tackle here the problem which more recent social theologies, especially the Latin American theologies of liberation, have foregrounded. Can we be certain that lasting structural change will come about if we persuade ourselves that the existing system, slavery or capitalism or legal discrimination against women, is being benignly administered? Is this not potentially an alibi that allows us to postpone the hard work of structural reform? But although this is not explicitly addressed, it's important that Bulgakov generally deplores a purely internalizing response to social injustices. As we have noted, he assumes that there is work to be done both internally and externally, and his stress on transformational labor as the distinctive vocation of human beings goes some way to offset the risks of falling back into any static conception of social order. So he writes, we must move away from a passive, quietist, conservative assimilationist relationship to the work of society. And this is necessary in part so as not to leave a dangerous vacuum. He's already noted the risk of secular or pagan society becoming what he calls a pseudo-church. What exactly does he mean by this? He is pointing to the way in which society can come to define itself as a comprehensive moral community, a community in which the relationships that exist with and within this group, ethnic, linguistic, class-based, or whatever, or this polity, free market, communist, or whatever, become the defining marks and boundaries of all human obligation and aspiration. The unanswerable and final moral priority in such a setting is just to fulfill the expectations of this particular human collectivity. And if the Church has no perspective from which to ask questions about these local priorities or expectations, the Church will not only betray its calling, but it will tacitly collude with the claims of the collectivity to final authority. The point being made is a subtle one, directed not only against the naked political totalitarianisms of Bulgakov's era, communism and fascism, but also, as he clearly states, directed against the soft totalitarianism of managerial technocracy combined with a successful consumerizing of human leisure and culture. The Church is called on to resist marketized and functionally reductive models of human work and human connection. And it will do so by maintaining its theological self-understanding above all, its self-definition in relation to the Sophianic and eschatological reality which it both partially embodies and entirely points to. This again has some parallels with Dietrich Bonhoeffer's ecclesiology, though Bonhoeffer has a far less ambitious cosmological dimension and a less explicitly sacramental focus. But all of this sets Bulgakov at odds with two kinds of Christian response to a secular or pagan modernity that have become more evident in recent decades. Bulgakov's skepticism about any return to pre-modern categories or discipline is plain. But if you look at the dialogues he wrote in the period of his Crimean exile after the revolution, which are laborious, agonized, and diffuse texts, you can see how he turned away from the Slavophile idealization of the medieval or the more recent Russian past. One of the participants in one of these texts, a long unpublished dialogue, a Russian parish priest, is scathing in his depiction of a morally apathetic and half-Christianized Russian peasantry, much to the scandal of the lay theologian who is arguing with him in the dialogue Bulgakov wrote. And to bring it to our contemporary setting, it's very hard in the light of all this to think of Bulgakov having the least sympathy with what has become familiar as the ideology of a Ruski mir, a Russian world, or with the mythology of a straightforwardly messianic role for the Russian people, suffering but triumphant in conflict with godless enemies. Equally, Bulgakov's insistence on the need for the church to combat the idea of an omnicompetent state as a kind of pseudo-church might at first be called on to support Christian resistance to the contemporary state's moral agenda, typically to the liberalization of legal attitudes to sexual minorities, or to abortion, or to assisted dying, but also in some contexts, as the last couple of years have shown, especially in the United States, to state directives about health or education as well. But in fact, Bulgakov is not so comfortable an ally for such resistance movements. He is not, of course, concerned with the culture war questions of recent decades, and he's certainly not likely to have been a liberal or revisionist in respect of many of the most contested questions of such conflicts, and I'm not claiming that he would have been. But the core of his critique would not be the specific moral questions involved, so much as the claims, explicit and implicit, being made for the absolute authority and the public unchallengeability of any new liberties granted by the state. His conviction that the church should not be trying to restore past models of social control suggests that he doesn't regard public battles about legislation as the most significant place for Christian activism. And his clear opposition to anything resembling coercive religious uniformity implies that he can envisage a society in which the church does not have to win such legislative battles in order to sustain its integrity. He takes it for granted that the church will be living in a largely desacralized environment. Its task is not to re-sacralize. Its task is fidelity, persuasion, and what he calls social creativity, a manifest willingness to work for social transformation. But this image of the pseudo-church is one that deserves some serious consideration. And Bulgakov's engagement with the idea of the soul of socialism is substantially a warning about regarding a social program as having in itself some kind of sacred and final significance. In an important sense, it is crucial for Bulgakov that socialism as a political practice does not have a soul of its own. That's to say, it doesn't have a metaphysical and spiritual rationale distinct from the cosmic hope which the church represents. Now, it's clear enough that the secularized apocalyptic of Marxist-Leninism is Bulgakov's major target, as it was consistently for him from 1905 onwards. But just as consistently, he has sketched a critique of the way in which social goals and projects of any sort can acquire a definitive, unarguable character. And they can do this just as much through the exhaustive reduction of human behavior to function or to desire and gratification as through overt totalitarianism. Technocracy generates its own absolutism. Once functions have been defined and allocated, no appeal is possible. And also, in a disenchanted world, once perceived problems of injustice have been resolved, there can be no appeal from the legal settlement prescribed. The gap between a legal liberty and a moral duty narrows. Thus, a society may legislate, for example, to permit physician-assisted suicide. It may create a new legal liberty, and it may then, tacitly or not so tacitly, organize itself so that the duty to facilitate this, or even the duty not to challenge its morality, is effectively enshrined in social practice and culture. Any such challenge may then fall under the rubric of potentially offensive speech, which disadvantages or marginalizes others. Now, I think that something like this is what Bulgakov has in mind in his rather throwaway remark about the dangers of a pseudo-church. The idea of a social order from whose purely legislative and administrative decisions there is no appeal. The possibility of intelligent dissent is treated by the state and or public opinion simply as something that seeks to delegitimize certain legal developments. It becomes much harder for the critic to say, or to be heard to say, I accept that such and such a thing is legal, and I reserve the right to ask whether it is moral. The state's attempt to finalize issues, to close down moral debate, is an aspect of that end of history mentality, which Bulgakov regards as one of the characteristic temptations of the contemporary mind. And for contemporary moral and political theologians, one of the most difficult areas to negotiate is how to articulate the need for this critical space without simply accepting a contrarian and reactionary agenda of the kind Bulgakov warns us against. Let me put it provocatively, and again, I'm not suggesting that Bulgakov would have expressed his view in such terms or in relation to such topics. But to take an example very current in our own setting, a provision like the legal recognition of persons who have undergone gender-modifying surgery may or may not be agreeable to a Christian anthropology. There is a serious discussion to be had about this. But a committed campaign to reverse or deny such recognition may not be the best use of Christian energy, when the real issue is to do with the assumptions made in the wider culture, social and legal, about the ideal uniformity of its moral judgments and the illegitimacy of debate. Rights to civil liberty do not foreclose such debate for good and all. And the cost of denying some liberties on the grounds of theological anthropology may outweigh the cost of apparent collusion with decisions that may be theologically challenged. But back to the main point. For Bulgakov, a pseudo-church is, you might say, a body of Christ without Christ. In the church, what most deeply defines us, and therefore what we are most deeply accountable to, is our relation to Christ, and through Christ to all other finite beings. We are creatively connected with all other beings. We are responsible for their growth and well-being and integrity because we are all equally related to the eternal Word that is incarnate in Jesus. This universal relation guarantees universal equality and mutuality, and it grounds the dignity of every finite subject or substance. The focal and determinative focus of relation is not one part of the created order, but a reality quite outside it. For Bulgakov, the reality of Sophia, which holds together the processes of the finite world as a mirror and a medium for divine love or beauty, something always seeking maximal realization within that finite world. Without that external focus, what controls or determines the values and goals of the elements of the finite world is bound to be just one finite power among others. Tyranny is built into secularity in this scheme, and legitimacy can come only from force. A church that simply deploys counterforce in such a culture risks stepping away from its essential calling of engaged and critical witness, the continued labor of discernment, which we've already touched upon. So, moving towards a conclusion. For Bulgakov's social theology, the great enemy is the temptation to declare that history is over, whether that declaration is made by a theocratic church or a determinedly and exclusively secularist state in which public dissent is silenced. If history is not over, if all historical action contains within it the prayer of longing for the full coming of Christ and the full realization of Sophianic harmony, the task of the Church here and now is to work out which historical actions are in tune with that prayer for the coming of Christ, and to open the world more fully to its telos. That discerning labor is not the same as a series of campaigning programs, negative or positive. It is a clarifying of possibilities whose outworking will continue to be argued over. But in this connection, one aspect of the Church's calling may be to seek out and support those dissenting voices which are active outside the standoffs of political struggle. The perspectives that come from humanistic learning, from the arts, or for that matter, the sciences. All those perspectives which insist on the irreducibility of our human capacity to predetermined function or to systems of wanting and getting. Intellectual and imaginative creativity, as well as the social creativity Bulgakov underlines, will resist the seductive finalities of secular ecclesiologies, whether they're ideological or managerial. The conviction that humanity is answerable to more than what currently suits the majority, or the majority government, is one of the things that preserves the possibility of the kind of discussion in a culture which actually changes perceptions. Cultures defined by absolutism and uniformity are eccentric as cultures because they close off the possibility of real learning. Perhaps if we wanted to characterize Bulgakov's vision for the calling of the Church in society, we could see it as a calling to be an agent precisely of learning, witnessing to the truth that what we know of humanity before God and in relation to the rest of creation is always capable of deepening and enhancement. It may sound odd to say that a central element of the Church's job in society is to desacralize its habits of thought. But Bulgakov's argument in these texts from the early 30s seems to be that the socialist mindset he identifies in a range of 20th century phenomena carries with it an implied anthropology which can all too readily be treated as possessing ultimate authority. A mindset in which a failure to recognize the dignity of the person and an assumption about the determined nature of economic needs and function and their dominant importance in culture come to imply that particular social programs cannot rationally or morally be resisted. This is what provides the pseudo-religious dimension that Bulgakov sees as the soul of contemporary anthropology. And this is what theology and the Church's practice must continue to resist. In one sense, what Bulgakov is arguing is that the only legitimate soul that socio-political activity can possess is the genuine ecclesial vision, the Sophianic hope of a renewed cosmos. The Church is called on to ensoul the projects of the society in which it finds itself, and in so doing, gradually to displace the ersatz soul of modernity, its reversion to paganism, which is the assimilation of the sacred to the visible and the powerful. The Church announces in its sacramental, and for Bulgakov, its iconographic life, in its active diaconal witness, and in its theological self-accounting, that humanity is already connected with its environment in more diverse and complex ways than we could have imagined, that its capacity for contemplative joy is always in excess of any satisfactory performance of functions prescribed by others, that its summons to mutual enrichment and nurture constantly puts our localisms and minor loyalties in question. The Church asks to be listened to, not obeyed. But equally, the Church asks to be listened to, not merely tolerated as a private eccentricity. Bulgakov does not offer any schematic suggestions for what that might look like. His chief concern is simply that the Church should not lose sight of its own cosmic and eschatological role, or dissolve this into something instrumental to national, partisan, or pragmatic agendas. And I suspect he assumes that if the Church does this with adequate robustness, it will command something more than grudging tolerance in society. For one thing, it will, ideally, show what authentic relation to the sacred looks like, as opposed to the awkward, potentially repressive, potentially contradictory discourses of the sacred that are generated by a secular culture anxious about the ground on which it stands. The Church will clarify what it might mean to speak of soul in politics without sentimentality or ideological ambition. And we must not, says Bulgakov, give way to eschatological panic. I quote, "The task is to educate the man who has been partially liberated from economic captivity and who now faces the danger of spiritual repression in the wake of his liberation from the curse, which is also, though just as much a blessing, of slavery to labor." Bulgakov offers us a nuanced and resourceful perspective on how the Church's future is bound up with its willingness to exemplify an anthropology capable of doing something like justice, not only to human dignity, but to the plain inexhaustibility, the excess of the person in relation. And this is a perspective, I would say, that has not exactly dated in the nearly 100 years since the publication of the texts I've been examining. Thank you for bearing with me.
Thank you so much, Dr. Williams. This has been a fascinating journey. You have unraveled all these aspects of Bulgakov's thought on socialism, capitalism, the secular and pagan modernity, and you have really brought us to a contemporary, genuine vision of the Church. I'm sure there's several questions. There's so many aspects to explore. I would like to remind our participants that they can use the chat or the Q&A section to ask questions or make some comments. Also, they can raise their virtual hand and I will happily give them the floor. Perhaps as we are warming up and thinking of this very elaborate lecture, I'm wondering if you could elaborate a bit more on, let me go back to I have several notes, on the human agency in bringing the church to its Sophianic identity. And of course, I'm thinking now in our Orthodox way of doing theology and articulating the vision of the church in our Orthodox ecclesiology. The community always comes first. So I'm really wondering how the human agency of the, not just of the collective community, but of the individual, and especially how the modern self is seen in the Bulgakov's vision for the church, and how does it come into play? Thank you.
Thank you. It's a very large question to answer, but I think it has something to do with the fact that Bulgakov, especially in his great theological works of the 1930s, is always challenging us, like other Orthodox theologians of the period, to keep in mind that the person, the active person, is more than just the individual. So for a Christian person to be active is for that person to be acting in awareness of their own involvement and dependence, that they are inheriting something, that they are already connected, acting for the sake of deepening creative connection between persons, and so always acting, you might say, within the body of Christ. Not, well, I suppose you could say Bulgakov, very much like Losky, whom you mentioned, is saying the simple opposition between the individual and the collective breaks down when we think of how human relation works in the church, ideally, because according to St. Paul, in the body of Christ, the gifts given to any one are given to be given to others. I am given life so that I may make others alive. And to act out of that conviction, I think is very much at the heart, not only of the issues that Christians should be involved in, but the way in which they set about it. So a Christian will be interested, certainly, in, for example, the pastoral care of refugees and asylum seekers. But the Christian will also engage with refugees and asylum seekers, not as an individual seeking to do good works, but as a person willing to receive gifts from those that they work with.
Thank you so much. I see that Pantelis is asking the floor. Please, Panteli, unmute yourself.
Maybe another one was before me. No?
Go ahead. I will explore the chat.
Okay. Your Eminence, thank you very much for this inspiring lecture. I noticed many things, and of course I cannot ask you about everything. For example, I was very much impressed by the way you define the pseudo-church or this kind of secular ideologies as the body of Christ without Christ. But I'm not going to ask you about this. I'm going to ask you actually two things. The one is a pure informative question, because you are a scholar of Bulgakov, and so there's always a question about his political engagement at the beginning of the Russian Revolution, when he was deputy, independent Christian socialist deputy in the Duma, and then what exactly happened and his relationship with the Socialist Revolutionary Party. This is just a kind of information question. And then a more complex question. You are not an Orthodox, but you are very much well informed about Orthodox spirituality, Orthodox theology. You dedicated your doctoral dissertation to Vladimir Losky, many studies about Bulgakov. I guess you know well also Florovsky. So there is a key interpretation, or there is a theory developed by Paul Valliere regarding the relationship between neopatristic synthesis and École de Paris, or the the Russian religious philosophy. So according to Valliere, if it was Bulgakov and not Florovsky who finally dominated Orthodox theology, so we would expect an Orthodox theology more open to modernity and to modern ideas. So you are not an Orthodox. I do understand that this is a kind of sensitive question, but nevertheless, I would like to have your reaction about this hypothesis. Thank you.
Thank you. Two fascinating questions. I'll answer them in turn. As you've said, Bulgakov was elected to the Second Duma in the first decade of the 20th century as an independent Christian socialist. He found the experience of the legislature deeply disillusioning. It was a period of acute, polarized political conflict, and he became very disenchanted with the radical voices in the Duma, in the parliament, because he saw them as pressing always for instant, absolute change, which was not going to happen, and refusing realistic measures, the hard work, as he puts it, of simply bringing about a change that would improve the quality of people's lives. So that was one of the things which turned him against a positive analysis of socialism, I think. He will use the word, as I've illustrated, I think, in more than one sense. He will see it as a perfectly reasonable set of policies, restoring control and freedom and protection to vulnerable people, especially working people. But he will challenge it when it becomes a philosophy of human life. I notice in the chat a comment about collectivism and the essentially collectivist nature of socialism and communism. I think there are other ways of approaching socialism, but collectivism is certainly something which he rejects. So he moves away from that. In the late part of the second decade of the century, after the revolution, as I've said, he has a period of monarchism. He's very, very almost obsessed at some points with the figure of Tsar Nicholas. But then in his exile in the Crimea, it all goes into the melting pot again. And the dialogues of that period, which, as I said, have only recently been published, show us something of the turmoil in his thinking. So it's quite a long story. But he never regarded the Russian Revolution as an unqualified disaster, because he believed there were many evils that it had to overcome. And that leads to your second question. What I've certainly been trying to indicate is that while he's not any kind of a theological liberal and stands quite at almost the opposite extreme from the liberal Protestant consensus of Germany, say, in 1900, he is not someone who turns his back on modernity. And I think you've asked a very interesting question. If Bulgakov's influence had been greater, would there have been a more nuanced embrace of modernity? I think the answer is yes. And I think there are some ways also in which the work of Lossky, who was closer to Bulgakov than he himself would have liked to admit, Lossky's own sense of what belonged to the human, Lossky's own personal political commitments are perhaps more affirmative of modernity than, say, Florovsky. And Olivier Clément, as a pupil of Lossky, but also an admirer of Bulgakov and of Berdyaev, is certainly someone who, in his long career as a theological commentator, shows something of what as I see it, a genuinely orthodox embrace of modernity might look like, not compromising the spiritual integrity and doctrinal integrity of the orthodox position, but not identifying that simply with a set of social relationships that belong to the past. So, an interesting question. I think that If you look, for example, at some of the work of Antonin Joukowsky, who is known to both of us, you see, again, an attempt to ask what would an Orthodox theology look like that had gone through modernity rather than turned away from it.
Could you say a little bit more about Lossky's modern aspect? Because this is really very important. And because, Lossky through Olivier Clément is a different thing than Lossky himself.
Oh, yes, yes. I quite agree. And Clément does some remarkable things with Lossky's inheritance. But no, I'm thinking here of the Lossky who was very much part of the Dieu Vivant group in Paris in the early 1940s. The Lossky of his wartime journals, the Jours sur les routes de France, 7 Days on the Roads of France, and the political and social thinking contained in that work, where he's clearly trying to think through some theological issues around democracy and popular sovereignty, as well as theological questions. So obviously, Lossky does not give his main attention to cultural and political issues. But I think the Lossky of those conversations in the Dieu Vivant circle, the Lossky of the journal, might suggest someone who is more open to modernity.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Williams. I'm wondering if Rebecca Therese would still like to raise her question. I mean, you already referred to her comment in the chat. I'm wondering if there's a follow-up question she would like to address. Rebecca, would you like to take the floor, please?
Yes, I would. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
I'm just interested to know Lord Williams' perspective on the relationship between communism and socialism, and whether Bulgakov discussed the similarities or differences between them. What was his view on it? Thank you.
Thank you. Well, the short answer is yes, in that these essays on socialism are partly stimulated by his experience of the Bolshevik Revolution and his thinking through of those themes. His earlier writing, let's say before 1914, shows rather more sympathy towards socialism as a neutral term. But what, as I was suggesting, what he comes to believe increasingly is that there is something, at least in the socialism that is around him, and the socialism that is being implemented in the new Soviet Union, there's something about that which is deeply hostile to the personal. As I've said, he's not interested in defining the rights of the individual, but nonetheless, the person, the unique center of agency, and the idea of society as a network of unique free agents together. He feels that is being obscured in the socialist vision as he sees it. So it's a complex picture, but alongside that, you have to put the fact that he, having begun his career, his academic career, as a Marxist, as someone who was attaining quite a reputation as a Marxist theorist in around 1900, 1903, he develops a very robust criticism of capitalism, and he never goes back on that. Whenever he returns to the theme of the capitalist worldview, he's pretty much where he was, I think, before 1903 and before his own reconversion to Christianity. So yes, it's a view in which, to go back to your question, he does see communism, Soviet communism, as enshrining what he most fears in the socialist mindset. He doesn't engage very directly with the Western language of Christian socialism, although he uses the term a bit for his own views in the early 20th century. What he might have had to say to some in the English-speaking world who would have called themselves Christian socialists, I don't know. But for him, the issue is whether there is a kind of spiritual content to socialism, which, left to itself, becomes hostile to Christianity. And his answer to that is yes.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Is there another question? If not, I would like to ask a slightly different question. Of course, we all know you are a very engaged ecumenist, and you have really played a significant role in ecumenical dialogue. So you spoke about the task of the church as fidelity, persuasion, and social creativity. I'm just wondering, how does where is the role of ecumenical theology in that, or how does our ecumenical engagement play into that?
Thank you. That's an interesting question. I'd like to think that fidelity, in the sense I'm using it there, involves not just our fidelity to prayer and sacramental practice, but also our faithfulness to other members of the baptized community, even those outside our own confession. Something about our common allegiance to Jesus Christ, even where we don't recognize full sacramental life. I think that common allegiance requires faithfulness to one another. And if we're to be faithful to one another across our Christian divisions, without compromising our convictions, if we're to be faithful to one another, we need a degree of ecumenical involvement and encounter to learn, to be challenged, and to discover how we work best together. So I would say there's something in that word fidelity which might help us there. I've always believed very strongly that in the body of Christ, we are not only called into covenant with God, but that by that covenant with God through Christ, we are brought into covenant with each other. And I realize that most Orthodox theologians would scratch their heads rather at the idea that the body of Christ includes those outside the Orthodox family. But I would say even those who don't belong to the Orthodox family, insofar as they look towards Jesus Christ, we have some obligation to be faithful to them and with them. I think if you look at a situation of, let's say, persecution of Christians, I think it would be very strange if, let's say, an Orthodox or a Catholic or an Anglican Christian were to say, I'm not going to stand alongside my Baptist or Mennonite brothers and sisters who are being persecuted. I would feel, surely, an obligation to be faithful to them, to stand with them, to share the risks they face. And I think that's been the reality experienced by many people in Iran or in China or in Pakistan or other areas where Christians share vulnerability. I have to be faithful to them. We don't share those extreme situations, but I think we still have some calling to be there for one another.
Thank you so much. It seems I have missed a question. I'm really sorry about that. Dr. Theophilos Abatsidis has raised his hand. Please, Dr. Abatsidis, take the floor. Thank you.
Ναι, ευχαριστώ πολύ. Θα προτιμήσω να μιλήσω στα ελληνικά. Έχω την αίσθηση ότι, και βέβαια είναι μια αίσθηση η οποία είναι ανοιχτή στη διάψευση και στη διόρθωση, έχω λοιπόν την αίσθηση ότι πολύ δύσκολα η χριστιανική θεολογία μπορεί να κάνει πολιτική θεολογία. Και για να είμαι και ειλικρινής, έχω την αίσθηση ότι η χριστιανική θεολογία δεν μπόρεσε να κάνει πολιτική θεολογία. Και εξηγούμε γιατί το λέω αυτό. Γιατί νομίζω ότι η πολιτική θεολογία ούτε ορίζεται, ούτε εξαντλείται από κάποιες περιπτώσεις χριστιανικής ηθικής, όπως έχουν να κάνουν, ας πούμε, με τις αλλαγές φύλου ή, εν πάση περιπτώσει, με την ευθανασία, ούτε από κάποιες παρατηρήσεις χριστιανικής θεολογίας. Χριστιανικής κοινωνιολογίας, συγγνώμη. Δηλαδή ότι η χριστιανική θεολογία πρέπει να αρκείται σε κάποιες παρατηρήσεις χριστιανικής κοινωνιολογίας και να λέει ότι κάνω πολιτική θεολογία. Από τη στιγμή που η χριστιανική θεολογία δεν τοποθετείται σε μεγάλα ζητήματα του κόσμου, όπως ζητήματα που αφορούν την αυτονόμηση της οικονομίας από την πολιτική, τη λειτουργία του παγκόσμιου τραπεζικού συστήματος, την ύπαρξη σφαιρών επιρροής μέσα στο χριστιανικό κόσμο, την πολιτική του πετρελαίου διεθνώς, την πολιτική της Δύσης στον τρίτο κόσμο. Νομίζω ότι από τη στιγμή που δεν παίρνει μια χριστιανική ριζοσπαστική θέση η χριστιανική θεολογία, δεν μπορεί να κάνει ουσιαστικά πολιτική θεολογία. Και θα ήθελα, σεβασμιότατα, τη σκέψη σας και αναφορικά με τον Μπουλγκάκοφ, ο οποίος ζούσε στην εποχή της Σοβιετικής Επανάστασης, της Κομμουνιστικής Επανάστασης, και πιθανόν να είχε στο νου του κάποιες τέτοιες σκέψεις, αλλά και αναφορικά με το σήμερα θα ήθελα κάποιες παρατηρήσεις σας. Ευχαριστώ.
Thank you. A very important, very complex question. So, first of all, it's, I think, perfectly true to say that Christian theology cannot simply step out into the public sphere and say, here is a clear, fixed Christian theological position on these very specific matters. I think it would be very rash for me or for anybody to say, for example, this is the Christian theological view about the nature of the market or the banking system. What we can do, and I suppose attempt to do, is, and here I go back to Bulgakov's language about discernment. What we can do is to look at certain practices, certain developments in our culture and our politics, and say, what kind of human life, what kind of human ideal, or what kind of human goal or purpose is implied by this or that development, this or that practice? If this is being promoted, accepted, sanctioned, is this in fact encouraging the growth of a kind of human selfhood, a kind of human perspective, which undermines the view of humanity which the church takes? In other words, if you have a public system in which, let's say, there is a very strong commitment to extreme competitive individualism, is not the church able to say that kind of humanity really poses problems for the body of Christ, and to begin to engage at that level? I think that's how I would see the task of political theology, not to, as I say, to step into the public sphere with a set of theses to say, well, you know, here is the political theology that will resolve everything for us, but certainly to ask those questions about discernment. And I was suggesting that Bulgakov gives us some assistance in thinking about our task as discernment rather than just conclusion or statement. Bulgakov thinks our job is not, as the church, to bring about the new society, but it is to learn how to ask better and more penetrating questions about the society we're in, and then to ask what is creatively possible, without having immediate answers. I think that is where his political views finally end up. He has a lot to say in the 30s about this theme of social creativity. And I suppose it's illustrated in some degree by his sponsorship of Orthodox action in Paris, his involvement, not always directly, but his involvement with the work of Mother Maria Skoptsova, Saint Maria of Paris, and her work with the homeless and the destitute, I think there's a connection there, and I would like to look more myself at the work of Orthodox Action and what was being said and discussed about that. So it's a large question, and that's not a very satisfactory answer, I know, but that's where I would begin to respond.
Thank you, Dr. Williams. Pandelis, you have another question, I see. Please take the floor.
Yes, as we're heading to the end of this webinar, to this meeting, and as I don't see other hands, so I would like to ask a last question, Your Eminence. You spoke about Bulgakov, about Losky. You even mentioned, I think, the book by Losky, 7 jours dans les routes de France, which was his notes from his participation in the French resistance against the Nazis. And speaking about politics and Christian politics and Bulgakov, and also referring to Maria Skoptsova, to Nikolai Berdiaev, to all these people, one cannot avoid to refer or to wonder what would be the critique to address to the Russian Orthodox Church for its involvement in the today war. I know that this is a difficult question. I know also that you are among the people who signed the Declaration of Orthodox Theologians on Ruski Mir, and my colleagues and I, we are grateful for your courage and for your clarity about this question. But let's say, because we cannot avoid this question, let's try to say something about this. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Yes, as I mentioned in the talk, I can't imagine that Bulgakov would have for a moment sanctioned the aggressive war of a supposedly Christian nation against another. I think that from at least 1920 onwards, he is asking very awkward, very challenging questions about the mythology of Russian self-identity. At the same time, he's still capable of writing, especially in some of his essays on the Jewish problem, still capable of writing in a way which I find very troubling about the sacred vocation of the Russian people and its relation with Judaism. It's a complex world and not one where he seems at ease. I've written a little bit about this. So I think all of these École de Paris people, those with whom Bulgakov was most closely associated before the revolution also, Berdiaev, Struve, Simeon Frank, I can't imagine any of them supporting this pseudo-messianic language about Russia as the defender of Christian civilization in that aggressive way. And having said that, of course, we all recognize that within the very rich, very complex history of Russian Christian thinking, there are those elements going back to Dostoevsky and beyond, back to the late Middle Ages, which have fed into the fantasies of the Russian holy people. So it's a mixed picture, but I look to this generation of Russian thinkers for some of the criticisms I would want to hear directed against the astonishing betrayal of Christian ethics represented by the present war.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Williams. If there is no other comment, I think we are now coming to the end of our seminar. Let me wait for a moment. Is there any last thoughts by our participants?
There is a message in the chat from Peter Bala from Budapest.
Greeting us from Budapest. Greetings back. So with this last greeting, I would like to really thank Dr. Williams. We are very grateful not only for your presentation today, which I'm sure many of us want to listen to and reflect on further, but we are also really thankful for your scholarship, your ecumenical leadership, and the vision you have for the church, which inspires us all. And we look forward to more encounters with you. I would also like to thank my colleagues who helped for the organization and the smooth running of this seminar. Our technical assistant, Panagiotis Theodosiou, and the colleagues at the Secretariat of Volos Academy, Ms. Valila Yannoutakis and Dr. Kostis Trigiannakis. And also many thanks to everyone for your participation. Several of you have been with us in the other previous online meetings. This is the last meeting we have, and we couldn't have
I would like to explain. Yeah, if you finish, yes. Katerina, I would like to explain why this is the last meeting.
Please.
Did you finish?
Yes, I just wanted to say that we couldn't have a better ending having Dr. Rowan Williams with us. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Katerina. Thank you. I will shift to Greek now. Στο πρόγραμμά μας υπήρχε μια τελευταία συνάντηση στις 27, just a minute, please. Υπήρχε μια τελευταία συνάντηση στις 27 Ιουνίου με το θέμα «Ο θρησκευτικά άλλος στην Ορθόδοξη, Χριστιανική και Ισλαμική Θεολογία των Θρησκειών», με τη συμμετοχή του Θανάση Παπαθανασίου, αναπληρωτή καθηγητή Ιεραποστολική στην Ανωτάτη Εκκλησιαστική Ακαδημία Αθηνών και αρχισυντάκτη του περιοδικού Σύναξη, και την κυρία Νάιλα Ταμπάρα, πρόεδρο του Ιδρύματος Αντιάν και καθηγήτρια Ισλαμικών Σπουδών στο Πανεπιστήμιο Σεν Ζωζέφ στη Βηρητό στο Λίβανο. Ένα πρόβλημα της τελευταίας στιγμής ανέτρεψε τον προγραμματισμό. Η εκδήλωση αυτή θα προγραμματιστεί, θα λάβει χώρα στη νέα σειρά διαδικτυακών διαλέξεων και εκδηλώσεων της Ακαδημίας από την ερχόμενη χρονιά. Οπότε αυτή είναι πραγματικά η τελευταία διαδικτυακή μας συνάντηση. Όμως, αντί για αυτό, έχω τη μεγάλη χαρά να σας αναγγείλω το τελευταίο συνέδριο της Ακαδημίας Θεολογικών Σπουδών για αυτή τη χρονιά, που θα λάβει χώρα από 16 έως 19 Ιουνίου εδώ στο Βόλο, με φυσική παρουσία, αλλά και με ταυτόχρονη μετάδοση, με live streaming, με τίτλο «Ορθόδοξες επινοήσεις της Ανατολής», με πολύ σημαντικούς ομιλητές από όλο τον κόσμο. Το συνέδριο συνδιοργανώνεται από την Ακαδημία Θεολογικών Σπουδών σε συνεργασία με το Κέντρο Ορθοδόξων Χριστιανικών Σπουδών του Πανεπιστημίου του Φόρνταμ από τη Νέα Υόρκη, την έδρα Ορθόδοξης Θεολογίας του Πανεπιστημίου του Μίστερ από τη Γερμανία, την Ορθόδοξη Θεολογική Ακαδημία Άγιος Ιγνάτιος από τη Στοκχόλμη από τη Σουηδία, το Κέντρο για τη Μελέτη του Πολιτισμού και του Χριστιανισμού από το Βελιγράδι από τη Σερβία, το Κέντρο για τη Φιλοσοφία και τη Θεολογία από το Τρέμβιντιε, τη Βοσνία Ερζεγοβίνη, το Βιβλικό Θεολογικό Ινστιτούτο του Αγίου Ανδρέα από τη Μόσχα, από τη Ρωσία, το Ρουμανικό Ινστιτούτο Διορθοδόξων Διαχριστιανικών και Διαθρησκειακών Σπουδών από το Κρούσνα Απόκα από τη Ρουμανία και το Ευρωπαϊκό Φόρουμ Ορθοδόξων Θεολογικών Σχολών από τις Βρυξέλλες. Λοιπόν, όσοι πιστοί, νομίζω ότι είναι εξαιρετικά ενδιαφέρον το θέμα των Ορθοδόξων επινοήσεων ή των Ορθοδόξων κατασκευών της Ανατολής. Με αυτό λοιπόν θα κλείσουμε τη φετινή μας χρονιά. Επιτρέψτε μου και από τη θέση αυτή να ευχαριστήσω θερμότατα το σεβασμιότατο Rowan Williams για την απόψινή εξαιρετικά ενδιαφέρουσα εισήγησή του, η οποία θα είναι σε λίγες μέρες διαθέσιμη στο κανάλι της Ακαδημίας στο YouTube. Και επίσης να ευχαριστήσω όλους τους συνεργάτες της Ακαδημίας Θεολογικών Σπουδών. Η Κατερίνα Πεκρίδου τους ανέφερε, να μην τους επαναλάβω και εγώ, για όλη την σημαντική βοήθειά τους αυτή τη χρονιά στις μέχρι τώρα 9 διαδικτυακές συναντήσεις μας. Να είστε καλά, καλή συνέχεια, καλό καλοκαίρι για όσους δεν ξανασυναντήσουμε και ας δώσουμε πρώτα Θεός ραντεβού για του χρόνου. Να είστε καλά.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Have a nice evening.